They must go through so many cups in Asgard. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the fourth film in the MCU, Marvel's 2011 action-adventure superhero film, Thor. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Thor stars Chris Hemsworth, Natalie Portman, and Tom Hiddleston, and was directed by Kenneth Branagh. It tells the story of the Asgardian god of thunder, Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, who must prove himself worthy following his banishment from Asgard. After more than a decade with these characters, it's always interesting revisiting the humble beginnings of Phase 1 of the MCU. Thor was only the fourth film in the now extensive franchise, and it was also the first of the series that I didn't see in theaters. It may be hard to remember now that we're approaching 30 movies, but this was still during the early days of the MCU, back when Phase 1 wasn't even a phrase that people knew. Back when we just viewed these movies as fun, standalone superhero stories, without the expectation of major connections and crossovers. Back before we knew just how integral every single movie and plot detail would be to the multi-decade bigger picture of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Watching these movies was a simpler experience back then. Prior to this film, I had very little experience with Thor, because I never read the comics. I know I mention that in nearly every comic book movie review I do, but I think the context is important, because I know there are plenty of people out there who already know these characters and story arcs before the movie ever comes out. But I also know that there are plenty of people like me who come into these movies needing the actual film to tell the story. Unlike some of the characters in Phase 2 and 3, I at least knew who Thor was before watching this film. I didn't really know any specific details, but I knew the general basics. And I also knew that I wasn't a huge fan of the character. Of the Marvel characters that I knew at the time, he was always one of the least interesting to me. Much like Superman on the DC side of things, the indestructible, super strong protector from space just wasn't very interesting to me. Thor is literally a god. That's cool when you want to see the bad guys get beat up. Not so much when you're interested in a story that feels like it has actual stakes. Now, of course, those were my feelings on the character before I really knew anything about him. If I'm being completely honest, those feelings haven't changed all that much, but I do like the character of Thor more now than I used to. That said, this film serves as Thor's origin story. You guys know I'm a sucker for superhero origin stories, so even back when I wasn't interested in this character, I was still curious to see his origin. It's no secret that most comic book superheroes were inspired by mythology. Even the superheroes that aren't literally gods can be traced back to Greek or Roman mythology. Superman is basically Zeus, Aquaman is Poseidon, the Flash is Hermes, and so on. But Thor's origins are a bit more Nordic. Thor, Loki, Odin, Asgard, Mjolnir, it's all lifted directly from Norse mythology. And this Marvel origin story leads very heavily into that mythology, while perhaps surprisingly, adding a very Shakespearean twist to it all, making Kenneth Branagh's turn as director a lot more fitting than you might otherwise expect. Thor is a very plot-heavy film. It's one of the shortest movies in the MCU, clocking in at just under 2 hours, but a lot of stuff happens. We've got mythological events, tie-ins to S.H.I.E.L.D., classic superhero stuff, and all that's in addition to introducing us to Thor and Asgard. There's a ton of setup for this movie. A full 30 minutes of backstory and explanation kick off the film. And for me, that backstory, and most of the true plot of this film, is just not very engaging. A lot technically happens, but it doesn't feel like it because of the pacing and structure of the film. This movie feels like two distinct stories, the mythological Asgardian drama and the earthbound superhero comedy. These two stories are only connected by the presence of Thor, and so the constant back and forth structure of the script makes the movie feel disjointed. Fortunately, in spite of all the plot, this is a very character-driven and character-centric movie. It's a hero's journey story. When we meet Thor, he's pretty insufferable. He's loud, brash, and itching for a fight without considering the consequences of his actions. So, when he loses everything, he needs to prove himself worthy of his hammer, of his status, and of his realm. I feel like I might be in the minority on this, but I find the Asgard portions of this movie extremely dull. It looks nice, and has some cool elements like the Bifrost, and characters like Loki and Heimdall, but the Shakespearean twist on Norse mythology just doesn't do it for me. Luckily, a decent chunk of the story takes place on Earth, and that's where this movie shines for me. It's not often where the middle of a film is its best part, but this is a perfect example of that kind of rare case. As much as I love an origin story, I love fish out of water stories even more, and this film manages to combine the two. The Shakespearean Thor is unceremoniously dumped in the middle of the New Mexican desert, power and hammerless, and a series of ridiculous interactions ensue. And this has always been the best part of the film for me. Not just because it's funny, but because Thor is humbled here. He isn't the dull, all-powerful god. He's a guy on a redemptive journey who needs help, which is far more interesting to me than any CGI battle against frost giants could ever hope to be. Even after all these years and all these movies, I still like this film. I'll admit, I'm always a little surprised when I look at my MCU ranking and see just how low this movie is. Cause when I think of this film, I always think of the fun fish out of water storyline. But then I rewatched the movie and realized how much of the story isn't that fun fish out of water stuff, and remember exactly why I put it in its spot in my ranking. It's a sporadically fun movie, but it really drags on both ends, at least for someone who isn't a big fan of cosmic Marvel. Honestly, I find chunks of this film are very forgettable. I don't even know how many times I've seen it at this point, and yet I'm still always surprised when I see Hawkeye show up for his little bit part. And also by all the Dutch angles. Seriously, there are so many of them. They might as well call them Norse angles. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is the fish out of water storyline. This might not be everybody's number one pro, but I love fish out of water humor, so this is an extremely entertaining component of an otherwise somewhat dull story. I know people like to gripe about the MCU's incessant need to throw humor into their movies, but I think it works in this case. Because here we have a god who thinks of himself in that way, but has no way to prove it to anybody. So there's just a lot of skeptical and confused reactions from people that are incredibly entertaining to me. Pro number 2 is the characters. So this one is honestly more of a mixed pro for me. I like Thor's character arc here. It's very predictable as a hero's journey redemption story, but it does a good job of fully introducing him, which is really the point of an origin story. I also like his interactions with other characters, whether that be Loki, or Jane, or even Agent Coulson. The Shakespearean element of the Asgardian interactions is a little grating for me personally, and I do think there are far too many characters in this movie, but the character-driven nature of the film helps to counterbalance the excessive and underwhelming plot. On the con side, the biggest issue is definitely the pacing. So I think for anybody, the basic structure of the story really inhibits things and slows the story down unnecessarily. We go back and forth between two very different storylines and tones. The dramatic Asgardian political drama and the silly superhero romantic comedy on Earth. Each transition is jarring and kind of halts the film for a bit. And this is only exacerbated for someone like me who doesn't like the mythology-heavy, cosmic, other-realmy stuff. To me, most of the Asgard stuff is just incredibly dull, so that means that large chunks of this film drag even more for me. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Thor or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Thor 3 out of 5 paws. Even though it has pacing issues and leans a little too heavily into its Shakespearean twist on Norse mythology, Thor remains an entertaining and effective origin story for one of the central characters of the MCU. I would recommend Thor to people interested in the mythological origins of superheroes. As a character, Thor is probably the best example of this, considering he's lifted directly from Norse mythology. This film really plays up that side of things, but also injects a Shakespearean twist to it all. So if you're interested in that, or even in Arthurian legend, you'll likely enjoy this film. And if you haven't been invested in the MCU since the very beginning, I would recommend this just so you can see Thor's origins and how far he's come over the last decade of films. If you liked Thor, I would recommend Thor Ragnarok. This is the third Thor film within the MCU, and really the one where he finally hits his stride as a character. It still has the heroics you want and the Norse mythology connections you expect, but is easily the most entertaining and fun Thor film we've had, at least up to this point. If you liked the Shakespearean qualities seen in this film, you might want to watch Henry V. This Shakespeare adaptation was Kenneth Branagh's directorial debut, and features quite a few story and character similarities. And if you're interested in some more Shakespeare under the Disney banner, you should check out The Lion King. It's basically Savannah Hamlet, and also features a prince who just can't wait to be king, who's banished from his kingdom and subsequently has to fight a member of his family in order to save that kingdom. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Thor? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie based on mythology? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.